back to this important lecture series, the 75 lecture series of Indian Council of Agriculture Research for a very important cause, and that is to celebrate the successful 75 years of independence of our great country, India. Many great personalities, they have delivered lectures. Till date, Dr. John, we have completed around 54 lectures, and today is your 55th lecture. We have to complete 75 lectures. And these topics have been on a varied areas, not only on the agricultural research, policies, the COVID motivational lectures, the yoga, and many more things. And in the same series, we thank you for accepting our invitation on another important area, and that is the transforming global food systems after COVID-19. A very important point for all of us to understand that how we have to meet this challenging and what kind of transformation is required. Friends, for the Dr. John is a very known personality in the area of policies. Dr. Johan Swinnen is the Director General of the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI. We have a lot of collaborations with IFPRI. And the Global Director of the Systems Transformation Science Group at CGIAR. So double responsibility he has got. Dr. Swinnen has published extensively on agricultural and food policies, international development, political economy, institutional reforms, trade, and global value chains. He holds leadership roles for various trans forces, including the Food Systems Economics Commission and the Think 20 Task Force on Climate Change, Sustainable Energy, and Environment. Prior to joining this IFPRI and the CGIAR, Dr. Swinnen was Professor and Director of the Lacoste Center for Institutions and Economic Performance at KU Leuven, led economist at the World Bank, economic advisor to many international institutes, and guest professor at several universities, including Stanford University's Center for Food Security and the Environment. Dr. Swinnen earned his PhD from Cornell University and holds honorary doctorates from University of Göttingen and the Slovak University of Agriculture. He is a fellow of the Agricultural and Applied Economic Association and the European Association of Agricultural Economists, and served as president of International Association of Agricultural Economists. Dr. John, I can just tell you this platform is being shared today by our many vice chancellors of agricultural universities, our many deputy director generals of the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, our secretary, Dr. Mahapatra, senior faculty of the universities, other senior staff of ICAR, many directors of ICAR institutes, they are joining this important lecture. So this lecture series has become very important, and thank you once again for accepting our invitation. Dr. Mahapatra, our secretary there and DG ICAR has also joined. So thank you on behalf of the Indian Council of Agricultural Research for agreeing to deliver this important lecture. With the permission of the chair, Dr. Mahapatra, who is going to chair this session, I request you now to take the floor and deliver your talk. Over to you, Dr. John, please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for this very kind introduction. Thank you also for setting the scene on the importance of this lecture series. And I'm truly honored to be invited here to be able to make a contribution in our current review of the global food security situation in the light of a number of changes that have taken place over a longer term and over a shorter period. I have prepared a set of slides. Can I have the first slide, please? I sent them through earlier. The organizer said it was fine for the
Anjani, who is sharing slides? John, who is sharing your slides?
I thought I sent them through the colleagues, I think, from the IFPRI office, who were going to connect them to you. I thought I can try if I can upload them from here.
Arpit, can you make Jyotsna as the co-host? Jyotsna Dua. Anjani, ठीक है? Jyotsna Dua? Yes. Sure.
There we are.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Next slide, please. Yes. So we are the previous one, please. Or this is fine. It's fine. So this is a cover of The Economist of June 2013. So this is roughly, it's a bit more than a year ago. It's actually 9 years ago. And so the cover of The Economist and the lead story there was really about, we are moving towards the end of poverty. So we had a growth we've seen economic growth for a very serious period of time. And my slides are moving a bit fast here, but yeah, perfect. For really about 20, 30 years. And so the story is really about this is going to be the end of poverty. If you look on the right-hand side, these are numbers about malnutrition, about hunger. They go very much in the same way. If you look both at the number of people that are hungry in the world, undernourished, and the share of the population, both continue to decline, and the decline starts about 20 years before that already. And this goes roughly on the right-hand side until 2015, the middle of next decade. And then what we see is a very remarkable thing. Things turn around. Next slide, please. So we've seen that afterwards, the growth of basically the very significant decline in hunger and malnutrition is disappearing. In fact, first it's stabilized and then it's growing. And this is very worrisome. And the question, of course, is this a hiccup on our way to ending poverty and hunger, or is it a significant structural change in the wrong direction? Next slide, please. If we look at the more broader perspective, from foods in terms of food systems, our food systems transformation, the transition that we want to make, it is even more complicated and in a way more challenging, because then we not only look at reduction in hunger, in poverty, but we also look at the impact on health, the impact of our food system on resilience, on inclusiveness, on sustainability, and of course on efficiency. And the challenges are even larger than the ones if we just look at undernourishment. Next slide, please. Here we see that this change or the reversal is what we see at the world level is actually happening in all the main regions in the world. It's happening in Africa, it's happening in Asia, it's happening in Latin America and the Caribbean. Okay, so it's not concentrated in one part of the world. It's a global phenomenon. Next slide, please. So what we see then, if we're going to look at some of the a broader definition of malnutrition, next slide, please. Then we see that if we look that many people cannot, beyond being hungry, if we look a bit of a broader perspective, we know that a much larger share of the world cannot afford a healthy diet. They have major micronutrient deficiency, up to 2 billion people. We're also now up to 2 billion people who are overweight or obese. And then, of course, we have a very significant group of countries in the world, and those are represented on the left-hand side on the global map, which face both the problems of too much and too little. in the sense of they face both significant issues related with undernutrition and overweight within the same countries. Next slide, please. If we then look at the issue of sustainability, there we also see that our food system, agriculture, but not just agriculture, but beyond it, and also the trade in food, the retail sector, the processing, etc. If we look at that, the food system as a whole, we see that the impact on the climate change is much broader than previously recognized, and certainly previously recognized in the policy debate, I think. So the food system consumes a large share of the energy in the world, and it contributes a large share of greenhouse gas emissions going forward. And you see that the colors of the parts on the left-hand columns differ a bit, in the sense that, for example, livestock production is contributing 2% to energy consumption, but 8% to greenhouse gas emission. Okay, and so clear. And for example, the processing and distribution is the other way around. But clearly, the sizes are substantial, and certainly taken together, they really contribute a very large part. And that means that the food system is part of the problem. But of course, if we can solve it, it could also be a very important part of the solution going forward, both in terms of resource use and in terms of greenhouse gas emission and climate change. Let's take a little bit, a brief look on what has changed and what has potentially contributed to this turnaround. Next slide, please. The one thing where economists look first is, of course, when you look at hunger, you look at income. And so here you see that there is a significant correlation between the turnaround in the undernourishment data and the development of GDP growth per capita in low and middle income countries, and particularly in Africa. Okay, so there was quite significant growth in Africa, maybe not by Indian or Chinese standard, but certainly by historical African standards, up to the middle of last decade. But since then, this has declined very significantly. It has declined on average in many countries. Okay, and that has certainly contributed. Another factor, and this is related to the income growth, and this is data from Keith Fuglieb, and it's represented in or used by Umalele in her new book. Next slide, please. This looks at TFP growth in the world across the different regions. Previous one, where we have the TFP growth, and there you saw that basically the slowdown. Can I have the previous slide, please? So on the left-hand, yeah, thank you. On the left-hand panel there, you see this is a long run period, it's about 50, 60 years. And you see the red line at the bottom is Sub-Saharan Africa. So that's the same area where you see income has gone down, and TFP there has stabilized over the last couple of years. In this way, South Asia has done much better. That's the dark green line there, and you see that their TFP growth has been significant over the last 20 years, really, and continue to grow. Okay, which is good news for the region, I think. Next slide. Obviously, climate change has played a role. This is, I just put the slide in because I cannot not talk about it. It has really picked up in the last decade, and you see the structural shift. And clearly, this is contributing both directly, but also importantly, indirectly to the problems of food security, or food insecurity, better. Next slide, please. One thing which is possibly a bit less well known is this one here, and here you see this is the indicator for the people who have to leave their houses because of conflict, their houses, their villages. Sometimes they can stay in the country but move to different regions. Sometimes they move internationally. It's the forcibly displaced people worldwide, and you see that number has doubled really in the last decade, from around 40 million people to about 80 million people. And this is, of course, very much contributing to acute food insecurity compared to some of the more structural reasons. Next slide, please. So the next slide summarizes results from last year's the global food crisis report. And there you see that this focuses on a more limited indicator. It's the crisis situation. So food crises are worse. And so there's an indicator for that. And in 2020, there were roughly 155 million people. And so here's the three factors which play a very important role in that. It's the conflict or the insecurity I just referred to, weather events, climate, okay, and other weather shocks, and there are the economic shocks, and particularly in the last year, these were in 2020, these were strongly related to COVID, and you see the impact of the economic shocks actually increased very strongly over the 2018, where it was around 10 million, 2019 more than 20 million, and 2020 more than 40 million people affected by it. So it's really a very strong growth. But in any case, the impact of all three is very significant. In the title to the slide, I refer this now as the three C's, the conflict, the climate, and the COVID shocks, to kind of summarize it, particularly in today's, in 2021 and 2022 terms. Next slide, please. What I will do now, I will go through a couple of slides related to through the impact of COVID-19. And then I will also turn at the end to some discussions of the impact of the current crisis, the conflict crisis, the Ukraine war, how that is affecting global food markets. In terms of COVID-19, IFPRI has done a lot of work on this. And so what I will present is a combination of some of our global modeling work, some country level analysis, both simulation work and actually survey-based work with data collected from the field. This is our updated simulation predictions, and so we've seen there that there was a very significant effect on global poverty, mostly through the declines of incomes and job losses that occur particularly among poor people. And there, the one thing which is interesting there is that initially we had expected that Sub-Saharan Africa would be affected much stronger than South Asia. And that prediction has been, we had to revise these numbers because of a number of developments that occurred. And still, until today, I think we have to be careful predicting these things to the future because there's a lot of things related to COVID that we still do not fully understand. What we see on the right-hand panel, and this has been strongly consistent with observation and reality in survey data, which I will show in a second, is that you see what an economist would expect, which is a shift if incomes decline. You see a shift from more nutritious foods, such as fruit and vegetables, some of animal products, to more basic foods, staples. And that is what our models predict, and this is also what we've seen in reality. Another factor that contributed to that is that, particularly in the fruits and vegetable area, but also in, for example, milk, etc., these are very perishable products, and therefore they have been more affected by supply chains disruptions. Next slide, please. The way that poor people's food and nutrition security is affected, is disproportionate effect. There's a number of factors behind this. One is obviously one factor that everybody knows very well. They spend the largest share of their income on food. Therefore, income declines immediately affect their food security situation much more problematic. The other reason is that poor people really have their main asset is physical labor. So it's different from more people with higher incomes who typically have assets such as capital. They may have lands, they may have houses, they may have factories. Okay, and so in order to gain income, they have to go out and work. And so this work, the physical labor, has been affected both by the disease itself as by the restrictions to constrain the disease. So this is the factor most and disproportionately affected, actually, the input factor during COVID. At the same time, we've seen disruptions both in the private food value chains, so basically businesses and trade being disrupted, as you well know. And at the same time, we've seen that social programs, which often include the nutrition component, have also been disrupted. And this, of course, affects poor people again more than wealthier people. They also have less access to health services, which played obviously a role. And then especially even within the poor group or some groups, for example, people who had to travel either to the cities or abroad to gain income. So that's what's referred to as ex-migrants. Next slide, please. Here is some data from observations from work in Ethiopia and East Africa, and this is in urban areas. And there you see that the two factors which we had simulated, and so is really consistent with our observations here, which is on the left-hand panel, you see that the poorest people have indeed suffered more from income declines than middle income groups and higher income groups. And on the right-hand panel, you see that the reduction in healthier foods, and so in this part of the world, in Ethiopia, for example, dairy products consumption associated with healthier diets was already lower before COVID-19 and has been affected more in the poor and middle income countries than it has among richer, more wealthier households. Next slide, please. We also see here is two sets of slides from the impact on public services on food programs. This is from a study that we did in Uttar Pradesh in India, and there you see two different effects. One is that the decline in services after COVID-19 hit. So that's going from the blue bars, which was before, and the green and the yellow bars after COVID. One is in April, the other one's in June, and in the summer. And you see very significant reductions in the immunization services, growth monitoring, counseling, etc. Very important services which are being provided to the poor. The one thing that where the indicator goes up is in public distribution of food, and this is a welcome sign. It's also something we see in many different countries, that actually food distribution services, some of the social programs, have played a very important role in addressing the problems related to COVID-19. Okay, and see there the impact has gone up actually, and so we've seen also expanding on social programs globally. Next slide, please. The next slide tells a similar story, but from this is from Nigeria, and there you see two things. One is that this is about school feeding services, and you see that the left-hand columns are all lower or smaller than the right-hand columns. So the pre-COVID impact situation in terms of skipping a meal, having less than enough to eat, was less a problem before COVID than after COVID. One also sees that the differences between the blue and the green bars is small on the right-hand side, which meaning that these programs were not working very well anymore post-COVID, or in the period that we measured it, compared to the pre-COVID situation, where there's clearly a difference in households having access to food, school feeding services, and those are not. Next slide. What we've also seen, and this is observed, and this is across the board, is that women are especially vulnerable. They're especially vulnerable for a number of reasons. One is that the health measures are affecting genders differently. Income shocks are affecting genders differently. And then particularly important from a dynamic perspective, from a longer term perspective, is that empowerment and access to schooling are negatively affected, and this we know very much that these things have a longer run effect, which are arguably more important than the short run effect, because if children are, particularly girls, cannot go to school, this is affecting their opportunities in the labor market and a whole set of related factors later in life. So that means if we design programs, policy programs, that we should anticipate these or take into account these gendered effects, and also adjust our programs in order to target these specific differences among gender group. And this, of course, can also sometimes it also applies to different social groups, not just gender. Next slide, please. Here are some data from our work in Myanmar, and there we find indeed that the rural female-headed households are significantly more negatively affected by reduction. This is about reductions in international remittances, which is a very important source of income in Myanmar and rural Myanmar. And we see that the impact there on rural female-headed households is significantly larger than on other households, male-headed households in this case. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes kind of our global. We have a data set at IFPRI now where we collect information systematically on the importance of social programs. social protection programs. And what we have seen is that, well, we know that these programs can take a variety of forms. They can be basically utility bill support, wage support, food aid support, and a variety of things. But we've seen globally that these have expanded significantly, either by introducing them in regions where they were not existing before, or in cases where they did exist, basically expanding their scope and then their width in terms of reaching more households than they were doing before. And so this is potentially a very important dynamic, has a potentially important dynamic effect, because it may persist over time. And I think that's a really important, potentially positive development. Next slide, please. There's been a lot of discussion and a lot of analysis on the impact on the supply chains. There, I think, are overall, I should say that there is what we have seen, what we have observed, is probably a bit more a positive or less, let's say, less negative than what we had predicted initially. So initially, there was a lot of media reports as well about supply chains which had broken down, food which was left in the field to rotten, trucks which were stopped at borders, etc. But there's been a lot of innovation in these supply chains, and innovation in a number of ways in terms of both social innovation, technical innovation, institutional innovation. We've seen rapid growth of digital technology, even in very poor countries, but particularly in the lower middle income countries, where they have grown very much. But also institutional innovation. We've seen school feeding programs, for example, on the public side, where teachers and people in the villages, cooperatives have gotten together and tried to reorganize them so that even they could continue to work in a different setup. There is a lot of heterogeneity, obviously, whether these are global and local, capital intensive or labor intensive. Again, labor intensive supply chains have been much more affected, I would say. And then long run versus short run, staples versus perishable. All these things play a role, but I think in general, the supply chains have been more resilient than we had predicted at the very start of the pandemic. Next slide, please. Here is results from a survey that we did in Myanmar. And here, these numbers are actually consistent with that argument, that when we ask the household what does really affect, or how are these various factors affecting you, what we see there is that the loss of income, the loss of job, is really much more important as a cause for problems in the households compared to supply chain disruptions. Okay, and so this is very much in line with the arguments I made earlier, and also some of our findings in other countries, that is really that COVID, the worst part of the COVID impact is actually an economic shock in terms of income loss and job loss. Next slide. This is, and these results are actually consistent with that. This is our estimates of the increases in poverty and in a number of countries, 3 different countries there. And on the left-hand side, you see changes in GDP along the value chain. So this is changes in output and value added along the line, along the value chain. And so these, the numbers on the left-hand side are for Indonesia, but the numbers for the other countries are similar. And so we see that the total effect, okay, and this is estimated for a 5 or 6 month period of very strict COVID restrictions. There you see the total effect is large. It's almost 40%. The agri-food sector is about half of that, around 18%. And there you see that farming itself, so is affected least along the value chains, okay, because it's in rural areas where there's significant distancing. That can be used in terms of the operations, etc. And so the further you go to the cities, if you want, the processing and particularly the services, which have been the most heavily affected, then you see that the decline has been much stronger. And then if we translate that to or relate that to the observations, where we see there's been relatively little difference between the increase in poverty between urban areas and rural areas, and that is related to this difference effect along the value chain, in the sense that the services which were very much relatively more important in the cities have affected incomes much stronger there. And so that farming, despite the negative effect, has survived or has been able to continue to a better, less negative extent. And that there is a trade-off there, okay? So in the sense that rural areas were relatively less affected than urban areas, but at the same time, most of the poor people live in rural areas, more so than in urban areas. So these two factors kind of offset each other or combine in terms of that the net effect in terms of poverty has been similar in urban and rural areas. Next slide, please. Let me then say something about trade and value chains, actually linking back to what I just said. Okay, we know that going forward, food trade is going to be really important, be it inside the country, between different regions, or in a case like India, it's a huge country, of course, between different parts, even different urban and rural areas, and of course internationally as well. Okay, and so in order to protect against, make the system more resilient, trade can play a very important role. Okay, it can also play a disruptive role depending on where the source of the shock occurs, and that's important to realize as well. Next slide. What we have seen, and this is a normal reaction, and so this is very recent results which come out of the work that some of our experts at IFPRI are doing, and so they have now put together this data set on trade interventions. This work by David Laborde and Joe Glauber, Rob Voss and their team. And on this is the number of countries implementing food export restrictions and their associated share in global trade of calories. So let's look at the bottom part of the picture. So that's the number of countries implementing food export restrictions. And this is for 3 different shocks that we have seen over the past 15 years, really. So the red one is the current Ukraine crisis. The blue one is with COVID-19, the first year of COVID-19. And the orange one is with the 2008 food price spikes on the food crisis, then on global markets. And so what you see is that in 2008, many countries introduced export restrictions. And so it's kind of interesting that it all happened in the beginning of the years. And export restrictions, and they persisted through much of the year of 2008. What we've seen with COVID-19 is that the same thing happened. A lot of export restrictions were initially introduced when there was talk about shortage on global markets, but these have been reduced quite soon afterwards. And I think international organizations such as the World Bank, the World Economic Forum, the G20, etc., IFPRI, FAO, etc., have played a role in that, in the sense that they could predict much better how much food there was available in storage around the world. Also say, listen, in 2008, we did the wrong thing. We made the situation worse, so we should not be doing that. And governments have responded by basically gradually removing again the export restrictions. The red line is what's happening right now, and there you see, in response to the current Ukraine war, that you see a very strong increase in export restrictions as well. And we are now out there arguing that we should be careful about doing this. Things are going to get worse because of this export restriction, and try to get kind of a blue line effect going forward as well. Next slide. I have 2 slides here on food standards. Okay, this in itself is an entire lecture, and I don't have time to go into great detail on it, but I just want to point out that certainly going forward, and I think COVID-19 plays a role in this, but certainly also when we start thinking about climate change, sustainability standards, etc., food standards are going to be, if anything, much more important in the future than they have been in the past. And here you see that over the past 20 years, food standards have grown tremendously. This is one indicator of that. It's SPS notifications to the WTO and global GAP certification. These are the global GAP. GAP stands for Good Agricultural Practices. These are certifications implemented by global retailers, etc., for their supply chains. So these are affecting rich and poor farmers simultaneously. Next slide. So what standards do? Okay, standards can be good. Okay, standards can be catalysts to trade, to sustainability, to poverty reduction, because they can reduce market imperfection, reduce negative externalities. But at the same time, they can also create additional trade barriers, etc. And what we see empirically is that they are used for both things. They're used for good things and for bad things. And so this makes it a very complex issue. Also, it's very hard to identify when the standard is used for a good reason and for a bad reason. And so that makes it a very difficult thing to deal with internationally. I have one more slide on this, which is that this is from a study that we did with the next slide, please, for the European Commission in 2 years ago. And there we reviewed the complaints that have been submitted against SPS notification at the WTO. And there what you see is that the same countries which are complaining the most about it are also the countries who are receiving the most complaints against them for using SPS. So it's a very mixed story here in terms of those who are engaged in using SPS a lot. They are both complaining that other countries are using it for trade barriers, but are also receiving a lot of complaints that they are. What's interesting there is there's very few poor countries there. There are some middle income countries, and you see that India is actually quite active on the right-hand panel and basically submitting a number of complaints that their trade has been hurt by SPS rules being introduced by other countries. So I think these things are going to become much more important, particularly if we think about global sustainability standards and the externalities of domestic standards, etc. Next slide, please. I have a few slides here at the end. This is the last part of the presentation on what's happening in Ukraine and global food security. I think these numbers most of you know by now. Both Russia and Ukraine play a very important role in basically in exports of staple commodities and calories, if you want. Mostly wheat is obviously a very important factor, about 6% each. And there you see that the evolution of wheat, corn, and soybean prices have been going up very significantly in the past year or 2 years. Next slide. What we see, though, is that there was already a very high increase in significant increase in food prices. And if you look at the real food prices, you see that the level there was actually higher than it has been in 2008. And that was prior to the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Okay, if you look at the global stocks there, so the two lines are, so they relate to the left line, that's the 2008 situation, okay, where we had the global price spikes. And there on the right-hand side, this is the most recent years, you see that the rice situation is actually better than in 2008, the rice stocks, but all the other ones are in a worse situation right now than they were at that point. So this is cause for a lot of concern, particularly in the, let's say, in the non-rice markets, if you want. Next slide, please. Their share is unequally distributed globally. We know that. I'm sure you know this as well. It's particularly the countries closest to Russia and Ukraine, which are most dependent, obviously, on their exports. And you see that in barley, maize, sunflower, wheat, and sunflower oil, these are really important global players. And it depends, again, the geographic distribution is concentrated. Next slide, please. This is an example from Egypt, which is hugely dependent at this point on exports, on imports from those two countries. About 85% of their wheat, and wheat is really an important staple commodity in Egypt, is coming from those two countries. The dynamic effects, or let's say the more medium-term effects, next slide, please, will also come through fertilizer markets. There is a very important fertilizer component there. Here, I just summarize it. This is the slide for the last 15 years. And I think the key point here is that there's been three major price spikes now over the past 15 years. And so that means that we may be in a new situation of what the norm is. So the norm seems to be instability rather than stable markets here. And so why may the situation be more difficult now than it was even before in the price spikes? The poor, as I explained, are still recovering from the COVID crisis. Hunger and malnutrition were already on the rise, as I also showed in the beginning. And COVID has not only affected households and private people, individuals, but is also affecting obviously governments, which had spent a lot of money on enhanced infrastructure, enhanced health measures to deal with COVID-19. And obviously it's unclear how long this is going to last. Next slide, please. These are the most recent data, and there you see that in the recent weeks now, price increases have slowed down a bit or have stabilized. And the one on the right, the slide on the right, the green line there is for rice, and you can clearly see that the rice prices are basically behaving very differently from maize and wheat prices, because Russia is and Ukraine are wheat and maize exporters and not rice export. And again, I think the storage situation, the stock situation of the rice market is better than in the other countries, the other cereals. Next slide, please. Here's the fertilizer and fuel prices. Here we see that the again, that they have increased very strongly as well. They are very important exporters, Russia and Belarus, and Belarus is also subject to sanctions from mostly the Western world, and the dependence on these differs again geographically. But you see that, for example, so the countries in Asia are somewhat less dependent on those fertilizers than the countries in Africa, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, where they are very dependent on it. Next slide. So the question is, this is really an outstanding question in the sense that the answer we have to work on is that what is the most important factor here for food prices and for the poor? Is it the commodity prices? Is it the fertilizer prices? Or is it the oil prices going forward? At this point, the three of them are very highly correlated. Okay, so in a way, one could say it doesn't really matter because they're all high. So but we know now that even in let's say low and middle income countries, the commodity prices are only making up something like 25% on average of consumer food prices. So that makes that 75% or 70% on average, okay, of the food prices is not going to the farmer, is not the commodity prices, but it's something else. Okay, and so that means that potentially the oil prices may be just as important going forward, affecting food prices than or even more than the commodity prices are. But as I said, since they're so correlated right now, it's kind of more, if you want, an academic issue than at this point than the reality. But obviously that may change in the future. Next slide, please. So here I made this point already. Are price shocks and volatility, are this going to be the new normal? Does that mean we have to make resilience the center of our global food policy going forward, or the national food policies as well, rather than thinking about high versus low, but more thinking about volatility versus stability? And this brings us back to a debate we've had, goes back to the 1950s. There was a debate on these things, and certainly also last decade, 2008, 2009, etc. And I think we need to bring this back on the table and see what the implications are for policy. Next slide. This is I think my last slide here on the. So if we think about resilience and inclusion, how to deal with them together, then I think we have to think about groups of measures, so measures to limit the frequency and the magnitude of the shock. So if the shocks don't occur, and climate mitigation certainly fits in here, then you don't have to worry about the impact. The second group is measures that, if the shocks are coming, be informed so you can anticipate the shocks. Okay, so this is early warning systems, digitalization, etc., very important. And then the third group is measures to absorb the shock. So if the shocks hit, that you can deal with it. Insurance mechanisms, for example, play an important role in there. And so my last line there is on resilience and inclusion, that they're intrinsically linked. And I think if the food systems are not inclusive, that means that the poor are much more vulnerable to shocks, and therefore that in itself will create instability in society. So, and that is not conducive to a resilient social system, and therefore not a resilient food system. But I think we have to look at them very much as part of one unit, if you want, of thinking about this. On The last two slides is just information about our IFPRI work, what we do and what you can find. Next slide, please. Here we have now a special blog series on the high food fertilizer price and war in Ukraine. We also have one still on COVID-19. You can visit all the information, all our work there is freely downloadable. And maybe for the analysts among you, next slide, we have a series of indicators which you are now collecting and we're making available free of charge on our website. Again, so we have the food and fertilizer export restrictions tracker, the early warning systems on volatility, the stock use monitoring systems, and the vulnerability dashboard, and a series of things. So please do visit our website if you would like to use these indicators. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to give the floor back to the chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johan, very much for this excellent talk, excellent analysis, excellent data interpretation which you have provided to our esteemed audience. Now, if you agree and if the chairman agrees, we can take up few questions. Dr. John, can we take a few questions? The first question is by Dr. Hridesh, and he's asking whether the simulation model can accurately predict the poverty.
That's a very difficult question. There is a huge debate on how to accurately measure poverty. I think our models are reasonably good in predicting the direction of poverty, kind of the increases, declines, and the changes in it. Measuring the level of poverty is something where people have been working on for decades and are still discussing quite a bit. I know that in Umalele's new book, there is a section on how to measure poverty and undernutrition, and that these things are still. But I think the models are reasonably okay in terms of direct measuring the impact of changes on poverty.
Thank you. Dr. S.K. Chaudhary, our Deputy Director General, is asking some questions. Can you give the co-host permission to Dr. Chaudhary, DDG NRM, Amrit?
Go ahead.
In the meantime, I ask you another question, which is by Dr. Arup. Why Sub-Saharan Africa is not that much affected in comparison to South Asia?
Yeah, this was, well, essentially, our initial predictions were much larger for Sub-Saharan Africa as well. And I think it's a mixture of things. So there's a couple of papers out there now who are trying to estimate or trying to explain, so these are written by medical scholars as well, why COVID has hit Sub-Saharan Africa less than people had predicted initially. And there is a number of hypotheses out, and I think people don't really know for sure, but they have hypotheses out. Part of it has to do with the weather. Part of it has to do with some form of resilience among the population because of just the way they have basically grown up among infections. Then there's a number of other hypotheses as well. And but we had it was unpredicted, and so that's also why one has to be careful. I also think that there may still be a chance that COVID is hitting harder in Africa going forward. The vaccination rates are low still there on average, and so it's one has to be very careful in this area, I think. But clearly, the impact has been less than we had predicted initially.
Okay, and now the next question is by another audience, Dr. Mahapatra, SD Mahapatra. Although the per capita food availability is increased globally, the most challenging task is availability of clean, healthy food. What will be your message to the researchers in this direction?
Sorry, can you repeat the question, please? I didn't quite get it.
He's asking, although the per capita food availability is increased globally, the most challenging task is availability of clean, healthy food. What will be your message to the researchers in this direction?
Yeah, I mean that's correct. Okay, so it's a very if you look at the numbers, okay, we are really not going into the right direction, and that is very challenging. It's a big challenge for all of us. And so clearly there is an income element there that we see very clearly, both from COVID and from the other crises that we observe now. And so there, the focus should be on income at the same, and so to increase access. But I think there's also an issue of institutions, for example, the food standards I referred to. So I think it's a mixture of different measures that need to be taken in this area. I also think that, for example, thinking about healthy diets and not just about or access to healthy diets and not just reducing hunger in terms of calories, it's a big thing. And that's affecting both, I think, our private food system and our public food system equally.
Thank you. Arpit, can you make co-host Dr. Chaudhary, please? Okay. In the meantime, let us take one or two more questions. Food production is continuously increasing, per capita availability is sufficient. Even government are having different public food distribution programs. Even then, what are the reasons why few people are still far from getting the sufficient food?
Can you repeat the last part of what you said?
He's asking, even governments are having different public food distribution programs. Even then, what are the reasons why few people are still far from getting sufficient food?
Yeah, I think part of it, well, obviously because there are so many people to serve, right? And so the government cannot do everything. So I think the private sector and the public sector have to play a very complementary role. I mean, just expecting that the government sector will take care of everything, I think is not very realistic. Also, much of these government programs have been designed in previous days, and so I think they need to adjust also, I think, to the new reality, and maybe there's just some COVID left effects that it makes it hard to actually target the new groups that need government programs and have not been well identified. I know that in several cases we've seen, even in the US, I've seen some recent data where restricted government funds can only be used in certain way, and so the issue of implementation costs become really crucial in terms of targeting the right audiences there, or the right audience is not the right word, the right households and the right social groups and economic groups.
We take one last question, and that is, India could avoid food crisis because of its buffer stocks and public distribution system, and also ensure food security of its neighboring countries. Given this, should we not revisit the rules of WTO, raising limit on support under Amber Box 2, revising the support base from 86 to 88? That is the question by Dr. P.S. Birthal, who is working in our Economic Institute.
Yeah, I know there is a long-standing discussion between, if I recall, I mean, I used to do a lot of work on trade in my younger days. I haven't followed the most recent discussion. I know there is a discussion between India and some other countries on the role of stocks and how they should be treated in the WTO. And so maybe this is a good moment with all the price fluctuations that are going on right now in terms of making the trade-off between, or reviewing again the trade-off between holding stocks and the global trade system and the policies there, and to see to what extent there needs to be a revision of that, or to what extent, I mean, we've seen in Europe, for example, the level of support to farmers has not gone down over the past 25 years, but the way farmers have been supported is much more efficient, I think, right now than it used to be, much less distortive. And maybe we can also look at the system, for example, in India and also in other countries from that angle, like how can we at the same time make sure that the security in terms of the buffer function is there and still make trade and markets maybe work better alongside it. Okay.
Thank you. We take last question from Dr. Chaudhary. He is our Deputy Director General of Natural Resource Management. Dr. Chaudhary, please.
Thank you so much. Johan, thank you and congratulations for a wonderful presentation. It was a pleasure and it was a treat to listen to you during this 45 minutes. My question is very specific to present day fertilizer scenario. The fertilizer scenario which is emerging now after this Russia-Ukraine war is really worrisome. It is worrisome not only for India and South Asia, but the world as a whole. Because we have some alternative with us, but many countries, they do not have any alternatives to go ahead with. Particularly the potassium fertilizers. India's dependence on potassium is very high on other countries. As well, nitrogen fertilizer, our dependence, at least 40% dependence is there on other countries where we import either gas or some raw material. Now, my question is, in this present day context, how agriculture will emerge in coming next 4 or 5 years? Because these 2 years impact of war, as well as the COVID situation and lockdown for last 2 years, already industries have suffered. The supply of fertilizer in many countries was not as per their requirement. And now, on top of that, this war has really broken the backbone of agriculture in many countries because potassium fertilizer, number one, is very costly. And secondly, some of the countries, I would not name here, some of the countries, they are taking advantage of the situation. They want to make money. And the other countries are suffering.
I'm sorry, I don't hear Dr. Chaudhary anymore. Yeah. Do you?
Yes, Dr. John?
Are you not able to listen me?
I heard the first part of the question or the comment.
Yeah, my first part was the present day fertilizer scenario, which is emerging, the potassium.
Maybe I have to log off and log on again.
Something is wrong, it seems.
Any problem, Dr. John? Dr. Chaudhary, can you just put in brief your question so that he can understand straight away? Put your question.
Yeah.
I think he's out. Maybe he's disconnected. So that's why he was not. Now he's again back.
Yeah.
Amrit, make him co-host, Dr. Johan Swinnen.
I have put my question in a bridge form now.
Dr. John, unmute, please.
I'm sorry, I hear you now again. I don't know what happened. There was a disruption here.
In the chat box, he has his question.
Just in chat box.
SK Chaudhary.
Okay. Yeah, it's a very it's a very difficult question. I mean, at this point, it's really hard to be optimistic, I think. It's hard to predict as well, because it's so hard to predict how long the war is going to last and the disruptions there. In a way, the trade in at least in terms of institutional infrastructure, the trade in fertilizer could be easier to recover, if you want, than if it lasts for a while. For example, the Ukrainian wheat harvest is really not coming true. But the dynamics, I think, in terms of the global markets are really potentially much more important through the fertilizer effect than to the current than the food disruptions effect, because it's affecting so many more countries in the world, and because it is much harder, I think, to deal with it in the medium run. So I think we should be thinking very hard in terms of alternative models, in terms of obviously alternative supply routes, etc. But already now the prediction I have seen is that people are telling that the food prices are likely to going to be high for the next, not just in this year, but also next year and the year afterwards, at least because of these dynamic spillover effects. Yeah. So I don't have a very good answer to your question. I think all of us are looking at this carefully and so, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Johan. And thank you, Dr. Chaudhary, for this question. Now, I request the chairman of this session, Secretary DARE and DG ICAR, Dr. Trilochana Mahapatraji, to give his concluding remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Agarwal, and thanks, profuse thanks to Dr. Johan Swinnen for an excellent lecture on transforming global food system after COVID-19. In fact, it was a treat. So many complicated facts explained with simple figures and diagrams. And after a thorough, intensive analysis, in-depth analysis, and explaining those with the facts and figures, it was a real treat, Dr. Swinnen, and we thoroughly enjoyed, your incisive, deliberation on a very complex issue, and that too at a global scale, and taking giving overall picture and taking some examples country-wise, and presenting before us those scenarios, particularly post-COVID, and how we were trying to improve, and then conflicts in the form of Ukraine-Russia war comes in, and then again impacting very, very significantly the whole situation, going again negative. So over kind of learning experience for all of us, and I'm sure all my colleagues, honorable vice chancellors of various universities, and scientist colleagues, students, faculty, and all enjoyed this. Very briefly, I'll summarize now the 5 minutes, and the kind of issues you highlighted, that speaks that the problem is still continuing, and we have to be careful. Poverty increase, as you said, and somebody raised this point, in South Asia versus Sub-Saharan Africa, and how it has behaved, and how much increase has happened. That is something we have to worry about. Why our measures in terms of, you have subsequently described that, taking example of Uttar Pradesh, that how it has impacted, particularly the public distribution system, and how it has actually helped. So we have to see in the South Asia context that how poverty has increased, and certainly you have given reasons that what all happened. The food expenses, because job loss happened, and rightly so. Reverse migration taking place from cities back to villages, and many returned without anything at villages, and government tried through a package called Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, and a number of measures were taken in India, but similar situation may not be there in other countries as much as they were there in India. And certainly job loss impacted expenses on food, rightly you have pointed out, and I'm sure that decline of in expenses on food items leading to negative impacts on nutrition as a whole. So that's very clearly highlighted and revealed from your presentation. Food chain getting disrupted, in many countries, very significantly, the public distribution systems not operating as effectively, and access to health services also not very effective in many countries. India produced vaccines, supplied vaccines to many countries, and also, millions and millions of people, getting vaccinated not once, twice, even thrice now with booster dose. And that is a very significant one for India. But I think, that is an issue, as an issue in many countries. Very important point that you highlighted is the vulnerability of the children, and women due to COVID. And so impact of COVID is there, very rightly said, and you said impact of the COVID in Ethiopia, for instance, the poorest getting impacted maximum. So the poverty and impact of COVID, being maximum there, and the problem getting accentuated further. So and poverty increasing as a result of that. So that's the story that you have actually described. And similarly in Nigeria, not getting enough meal and running out of food, and leading to skipping of meals, and so on and so forth. Various parameters you have highlighted how COVID has really impacted very negatively the whole population. And women, as I said, being most vulnerable. Once one looks at the data of men versus women with regard to health, and also, children, particularly school-going children, and getting impacted maximum, staying at home, attending online courses, and not very effective teaching happening and learning happening, though teaching was quite effective in terms of communication using online methods. But this aspect probably needs analysis, that learning also was not very effectively happening actually. So this requires a deeper analysis. Of course, the income shocks, as you described, in several countries, including Myanmar, income declining, and so on and so forth, and job loss happening, impacting, many different sections. Supply chains again, getting disrupted. Similarly, in Indonesia, rural people getting impacted more than the urban, and obvious reason that rural getting more impacted, as compared to urban. And then you did a comparison with regard to farming, processing, services, how differentially getting impacted because of COVID, and how services getting impacted, and severity of that, and very nicely depicted with a very good analysis, and telling us that this is how things can complicate because of a pandemic situation. And we didn't see a pandemic of this dimension, in recent history, and in our lifetime, all of us, we saw this first time. And certainly it is far and wide and all across the globe, and getting impacted. So this is there are several kind of lessons to learn from the analysis that you did. And obviously, we can do further analysis and go deeper region-wise. And in fact, in India, we would be very happy to actually do this further, because overall pictures, and as you rightly said, India is very complex. And the Uttar Pradesh state that you have chosen for analysis is a country, in terms of population, in terms of diversity. And imagine several other states. And so probably we need to really do a similar kind of analysis to understand, the COVID impacts, and how the food system and agriculture in this country has grown so well, more than 3.5% growth despite COVID. Very importantly, even fishery and animal husbandry, particularly the dairy sector, growing close to 6%. I mean, that's something very, very interesting. And although we expected disruptions there, but things moved quite well. Even horticulture sector also doing good. So our total production increasing and productivity has increasing. So that's something which is in our case presenting a bit different kind of situation. And in the process, we are able to not only increase our export but also provide free food through PDS to more than 800 million people. I mean, that's something which is, and for several months. So that's the kind of situation which was here. And equity, all taken into account to support the poor, most vulnerable class of people here, and particularly those who returned home because of reverse migration. So that was taken care. But certainly, when the shocks were to be observed, then comes this conflict, and you have rightly how conflict has impacted various aspects: the trade, the food systems, value chains, and the food standards and the SPS. You have taken the kind of numbers, the graphical that you presented, how it has increased over times and during war particularly. And of course, these standards could be catalytic, as you said, at times could be prohibitive with regard to trades, and could place restrictions. So it could be both ways, but depends in which region, how they are treated, and for what purpose they are treated. And we have seen the purpose matters. Standards on their own are useful, they are required. We need to really maintain food safety is so crucial and important. Consumers are becoming more and more conscious of safe and nutritious food globally, and so also in India. And I believe that these standards, we have also a standard authority which keeps some setting these standards. So they are all important, but how we use and or misuse to safeguard one's own interest with regard to trade. So there are kind of various complexities. I'll not go into that, but certainly that aspect is quite very interesting, that what you presented. The kind of trade which is happening, and you rightly pointed out, the prices are increasing, and wheat and maize that you highlighted and contrasted that with rice. And because the rice production areas and trade areas, they are not really impacted much, while wheat and maize areas, and particularly the production which was happening, and around 6% share of global calorie, as you rightly said, by Russia and Ukraine. So obviously, war has impacted in a big way, and as it was highlighted, the potassic fertilizer, for instance, and the prices are rising, and certainly it is going to impact agriculture, not just in a shorter term, but maybe a little longer term it would impact. It would not just impact agriculture. In fact, it would impact even employment, because a supply chain was operating, and a number of people were employed in the whole system, and then also there were kind of livelihoods and incomes based on that. And you did mention that oil price and food price are a consequence of that, and how they are getting impacted because of the war. and because of the fertilizer fuel prices increasing. So you rightly said that the new normal is emerging, and how long that will remain normal, we do not know. And certainly we hope that that new normal would change for better in shorter term or medium term, so that agricultural production systems and sustainability of production systems are not really impacted. So COVID is relenting to a certain extent, and I'm sure it would normalize within a maximum period of 1 year. Maybe even this phase in India, for instance. So I believe that it may not be as lethal as it was in the past. And though there are problems in China, as it appears, and China escaped earlier phases, but this time, there are some concerns in China. So shutdowns are happening. So there is a need, as you rightly said, that we need to really address the shocks and the volatility which are there. Of course, our social programs have to be scaled and have to be sustained, and this is a very, very important point you have highlighted. And that's the kind of message from such lectures that we are receiving and trying to communicate to appropriate authorities, that the social programs should be continued with regard to scaling. And this sustenance is, sustaining such programs is very, very important. Food aid, cash transfer, that happened in India. In fact, this cash transfer, direct benefit transfer, what we call, and 2,000 rupees in one batch, and then 6,000 rupees per farmer per year, and in 3 phases. So that has really helped the poor farmers in this country. And food price control, as you rightly pointed out, is also very, very crucial for poor to sustain, and those who have lost their jobs to really survive. So food aid and food price control and cash transfer, as you rightly said, such measures should be scaled and should continue, and should be replicated in countries as much as possible wherever such problems are existing. And restructuring supply chains and food systems, again, rightly pointed out that we have to see there are heterogeneity, as you rightly pointed out, at global scale. If you see, regional disparities are there. So obviously localized solutions have to be there, localized systems have to be adopted, and short term to long run approaches have to be adopted, and certainly staples are important, and perishables are far more important, and with greater focus, because the horticulture produce, for instance, would provide the much needed nutrition. So how do we really focus and then provide that? And as you rightly said, innovations would be key. And you did mention about digital platforms and how increasingly we have used during COVID. And it has really provided, not only in food supply system, marketing system, but also in agriculture education system. And that's most crucial, because if one loses 2 complete years, then it is really killing a career. So 2 years, more than 2 years, and providing education using digital platforms and technology, smart classrooms, and so on and so forth. So digital growth, and also that digital growth encouraging youth to come back to agriculture and to adopt and also provide services using digital platforms. And that is increasing. That's a very good outcome of positive outcome of this COVID. And it's increasing, very significantly at this point. So the jobless youth coming back to agriculture and providing digital solutions to agriculture, bringing precision agriculture, and reducing input use and bringing sustainability, to the system. So I believe, these are the important points to take note. And of course, as you rightly said, measures to limit the frequency and magnitude of shocks. I think this is very, very important. How do we really do this? Many are natural, but COVID-like situation, can we really predict when the next one is going to come? And how much of data analytics we use, and how much of fundamentals we do, innovative science we do in the wild, using the wild, or the evolution models which are built now. Understanding those models and deploying those models to predict what is going to happen in how many, what is the time frame, and when, and how many years. So I believe that would be useful to define and design measures to limit the frequency and magnitude of such shocks. But more importantly, the shocks due to climate change, shocks due to conflicts like Ukraine, Russia, requires a whole lot of efforts. And there our human interventions and intelligent strategic interventions are very, very crucial to reduce the magnitude of such shocks. And I'm sure the measures be informed measures, and informed measures requires scientific evidences, and our all engagement through our programs at the international level, and collaborative and complementary manner. If we work together, we should be able to provide regionally and globally scientific evidence-based, informed measures to address the problems which are there, and reduce shocks and vulnerability which is there, and volatility that you see. And when we do that, certainly, as you rightly said, we should be putting measures in place so that we are able to observe these shocks very effectively, and the process improve upon our resilience with regard to sustainable food systems and nutrition, better nutrition outcomes, and also in the process take into account the inclusivity and equity that's so important in today's world, and that has been important in the past, more important in the context of COVID and conflict and climate change, as you rightly pointed out. So it was an excellent presentation, and these are the kind of lessons we learned from this. And thank you very much, Dr. Johan Swinnen, for joining us today in this 75th years of India's independence, what is called as Azadi ka Amrit Mahotsav. So this, we have 75 lecture series, and you are part of this, and we have learned so much. So thank you very much. Let us give him a big hand, for his excellent presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Dr. Agrawal.
Thank you, sir, for nicely summarizing and giving the viewpoints of our India, the ICAR, what we are doing. So thank you, Dr. John, once again for delivering this excellent talk. And on behalf of the audience, on behalf of the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, on behalf of the state agriculture universities, I profusely thank you and the IFPRI for making it possible to have your lecture, long-awaited lecture. So thank you all the audience for being connected in a big number today. And we are having next lecture probably on 10th of May. So thank you once again. Namaskar.
Thank you.
This is great. Thank you.
Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you. Thank you.
So this session ends.